They always said a lost wolf followed its instincts home, but no one ever imagined the Alpha King's forgotten soul would choose a lonely chicken coop before it remembered a throne. Rain hammered the cedar roof of Emily Carter's tiny farmhouse with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that refused to surrender. Beyond the windows, the endless pines swayed beneath a restless October sky, and every gust of wind rattled the weathered fence surrounding the little chicken yard she had spent years building with her own hands. The nearest town was almost 12 miles away, and the neighboring pack houses sat even farther beyond the forested hills. Emily liked it that way. Solitude never judged an Omega for being quiet. Solitude never whispered that kindness was weakness. She pulled on her old canvas jacket and lifted the lantern from its hook as an anxious chorus of clucks suddenly burst through the darkness. Her hens were never this frightened without reason. Foxes sometimes wandered close, and once a hungry black bear had sniffed around the grain shed before wandering back into the woods, but tonight felt different. The fear in the chickens wasn't wild panic. It sounded almost uncertain. Emily stepped into the rain, her boots sinking into damp earth as cold droplets soaked loose strands of chestnut hair against her cheeks. The lantern cast a warm golden circle that danced across puddles and weathered fence posts until she reached the coop. The nervous fluttering inside stopped all at once. Silence settled over everything except the rain. Emily tightened her grip on the lantern handle and slowly unlatched the wooden door. What she expected was chaos. What she found stole the breath from her lungs. Curled carefully into the far corner of the straw lay the largest wolf she had ever seen. His thick coat shimmered somewhere between black and silver beneath the lantern light, soaked from the storm, yet strangely beautiful despite the mud clinging to his fur. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't growl. Instead, pale silver eyes lifted toward her with a quiet confusion that felt painfully human. They weren't the eyes of a hunter preparing to strike. They were the eyes of someone searching for an answer that had disappeared. Emily remained perfectly still. Every lesson she had ever heard warned her to run from a rogue wolf. Yet nothing about this creature matched the terrifying stories passed around winter fires. He looked exhausted, lost, alone. The hens, instead of scattering in terror, huddled together behind him as though they sensed the same impossible truth she suddenly felt deep inside her chest. The wolf slowly lowered his head onto the straw without breaking eye contact, almost as if he were asking permission to remain where he had collapsed. Emily's heartbeat softened. "Well," she whispered with the faintest smile, "you certainly picked an unusual place to spend the night." The wolf blinked once, and somewhere far beyond memory, an image flickered through his mind. A towering stone castle, a silver crown, voices calling a name he could no longer remember. The vision vanished before he could grasp it, leaving only the warm glow of a lantern, the gentle scent of fresh hay, and the calm face of the young Omega who, without realizing it, had just welcomed a forgotten king into the safest place he would ever find. Emily Carter had never believed that trust appeared all at once. It arrived in quiet moments, one careful choice after another, just like the first rays of morning creeping across the hills beyond her farmhouse. Dawn painted the forest in pale gold as she carried a bucket of fresh water toward the chicken coop, uncertain what she would find after a restless night. Part of her expected the mysterious wolf to be gone. Another part feared he might have frightened the hens after she returned to the house. Instead, she stopped in surprise. Every chicken wandered calmly through the yard while the enormous wolf remained exactly where she had left him, lying just outside the coop with his head resting on his front paws. The hens walked around him without fear, pecking lazily at scattered grain as though he had become nothing more than another weathered fence post beneath the autumn sun. Emily could not help smiling. "I suppose you are not interested in breakfast that looks like feathers," she murmured. The wolf slowly lifted his head. Those pale silver eyes followed her every movement, alert yet strangely gentle. He did not approach. He simply watched. Emily filled an old metal bowl with water and carefully slid it across the grass before taking several slow steps backward. The wolf hesitated before rising on powerful legs, every movement graceful despite the exhaustion lingering in his body. He lowered his head and drank quietly, never taking his eyes off her for very long, as though he feared she might disappear if he looked away. Afterward, Emily disappeared into the farmhouse and returned carrying leftover roasted turkey, breaking it into smaller pieces before placing them near the bowl. Once again, she stepped back. The wolf sniffed cautiously before eating with surprising patience, never rushing, never showing the desperate hunger of a wild predator. Something about his manners made no sense. Even the way he paused after each bite felt oddly familiar, almost disciplined, as though invisible lessons still guided him despite the emptiness inside his mind. He wanted to remember why. Every few moments, strange flashes flickered behind his eyes. Towering stone walls crowned with silver banners. Voices echoing through vast halls. A polished sword resting upon dark oak. None of it stayed long enough to become real. Each memory dissolved like morning fog before he could understand its meaning. Confused, he closed his eyes, and another scent replaced those broken images. Fresh bread cooling on a wooden counter. Wildflowers carried by the breeze. The soft scent of cedar lingering on the jacket worn by the young woman standing only a few yards away. Somehow that simple fragrance calmed the storm inside his thoughts more than anything else. Emily noticed the tension slowly leaving his body. "You look like you have forgotten where you belong," she whispered softly. "Until you remember, I guess you can stay here." The wolf tilted his head as though trying to understand every word. His tail gave the smallest movement before becoming still again. Emily laughed quietly, surprising even herself. She had spent years speaking mostly to chickens, gardens, and the wind. Now she was having a conversation with the largest wolf she had ever seen. She glanced toward the forest surrounding her property. If someone from the neighboring pack discovered him first, they would almost certainly drive him away before asking questions. The thought left an unexpected ache in her heart. "Everyone deserves one safe place," she said, folding her arms against the crisp morning air. "Even if they cannot remember how they got there." The wolf slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. He stopped without crossing the invisible line between caution and trust. Emily extended one hand, leaving the choice entirely to him. Seconds stretched into silence before the great wolf lowered his nose and gently brushed her fingertips. At that instant, another forgotten image burst across his mind with startling clarity. A voice filled with loyalty declared, "Your Majesty," followed by the gleam of a silver crown resting upon black velvet. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only a single feeling behind. Somehow, without knowing her name or his own, he was certain the young Omega standing before him had already become the safest memory he possessed. 3 days passed, and the quiet rhythm of Emily Carter's little farm settled into something neither she nor the mysterious wolf questioned anymore. Every sunrise began with fresh water, scattered grain for the hens, and a silent companion following a respectful distance behind her through the dewy grass. He never wandered beyond the old split-rail fence unless she walked toward the woods, and even then he always returned before sunset, as though an invisible thread tied him to the weathered farmhouse. Emily eventually began calling him Ash, not because she knew anything about his past, but because the silver streaks woven through his dark coat reminded her of fireplace ashes glowing beneath fading embers. Each time she spoke the name, the wolf looked toward her immediately, as though some forgotten part of himself recognized that being called anything at all was better than the endless emptiness where his identity should have been. While peace quietly grew around the farmhouse, the northern kingdom slipped further into uncertainty. Far beyond the pine forests, enormous stone gates remained open day and night as royal messengers rode tirelessly across every territory carrying the same urgent proclamation. Their king had vanished without explanation. Patrols searched mountain passes, forgotten trails, abandoned villages, and ancient forests. Every alpha pledged loyalty in public, yet whispers spread behind closed doors. Some believed the king had willingly disappeared. Others feared betrayal from someone inside the royal court. No one dared speak those suspicions too loudly, but every passing day without their ruler allowed ambition to grow where loyalty had once stood. Emily knew nothing about any of it. News traveled slowly to isolated farms, and she rarely visited neighboring settlements unless she needed supplies that could not be grown or repaired at home. On Saturday morning, she drove her aging pickup truck into the small-town market nearly 11 miles away with baskets filled with fresh eggs, homemade preserves, and bundles of late-season herbs. Ash remained hidden among the trees overlooking the gravel road until her truck disappeared beyond the bend, watching silently before retreating into the safety of the surrounding forest. At the market, familiar faces greeted Emily warmly, but beneath every smile lingered uneasiness. Two elderly farmers stood beside stacked pumpkins, discussing increased patrols moving through nearby counties. A young mechanic mentioned seeing unfamiliar black SUVs traveling the highways before sunrise. Even the local sheriff admitted that search teams had been asking unusual questions about oversized wolf tracks. Emily listened politely while arranging cartons of eggs across her wooden stand. She assumed someone was tracking an unusually large wild animal displaced by early storms. She never imagined the quiet guest sleeping beside her chicken coop could be the reason strangers were searching every forest road for hundreds of miles. Back at the farmhouse, Ash wandered through the orchard where fallen apples covered the ground in shades of crimson and gold. A breeze carried unfamiliar scents across the hills, causing him to lift his head sharply. Leather, steel, pine smoke, horses. The smells stirred something buried deep inside him. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. A vast hall lined with banners. Dozens of proud voices rising together. Someone placing a heavy cloak across his shoulders while declaring an oath that echoed through his heart more clearly than his mind. Before he could grasp another detail, the vision shattered. A sharp ache pulsed behind his eyes, forcing him to lower himself beneath the oldest apple tree. Frustration settled over him like another autumn cloud. He knew those memories belonged to him, yet they floated forever beyond reach. Late that afternoon, Emily returned home humming softly as she carried groceries toward the porch. Ash immediately rose and crossed the yard to meet her, relief replacing the confusion clouding his silver eyes. Emily smiled the moment she saw him waiting. "I brought something special," she said, pulling a small package of smoked turkey from one of the paper bags. The wolf gently nudged her shoulder before accepting the treat, and for reasons neither of them understood, the simple kindness made another forgotten certainty settle quietly inside his soul. Whatever life he had lost before waking in the storm, somehow every path that still mattered now led back to the lonely Omega who always came home. Life on the little farm settled into a peaceful routine that neither Emily Carter nor Ash had planned, yet both quietly depended upon. Every morning began with the soft clucking of hens waiting for breakfast, the distant songs of meadow birds drifting through crisp autumn air, and the familiar sound of Emily humming while she carried feed across the yard. Ash followed close enough to watch over her, but never so close that she felt crowded. Sometimes he lay beneath the old maple tree while she repaired fences. Other times he wandered beside her through the pumpkin patch, stopping whenever she stopped, listening whenever she spoke, even though she never expected an answer. "You are a very good listener," she laughed one afternoon as she gathered fresh herbs near the porch. "I wish people made as much sense as you do." Ash tilted his head, earning another smile that somehow warmed something inside him more deeply than the afternoon sun. He still could not remember who he had once been, but he had begun remembering who he wanted to be whenever she looked at him that way. A few days later, Emily drove into town again, leaving him to watch over the farm until sunset. He remained near the chicken coop for most of the afternoon before an unfamiliar scent drifting through the breeze caught his attention. It smelled faintly of pine resin, polished leather, and distant snowfall. Without understanding why, he followed it beyond the orchard and climbed a low ridge overlooking the valley. From there he could see endless forests stretching toward blue mountains on the horizon. The view struck him with unexpected force. Suddenly another fragment flashed through his mind. He stood upon a stone balcony overlooking thousands of towering pines while silver banners danced in a cold mountain wind. Men and women below raised their voices together, not in fear but in loyalty. Someone beside him spoke with unwavering confidence. "The Northern Kingdom stands because you stand." Before he could turn toward the familiar voice, the vision dissolved into empty sky. Ash staggered backward, breathing heavily as confusion washed over him once more. He searched desperately for another memory, another face, another name, but nothing remained except a lingering feeling that countless lives had once depended upon him. He lowered himself onto the cool grass, closing his eyes against the ache growing inside his head. Then another scent reached him, gentle and unmistakable. Fresh bread. lavender soap, cedarwood warmed by afternoon sunlight. Emily. The pain eased almost immediately. He opened his eyes and instinctively turned toward the farmhouse miles away, as though every instinct inside him insisted that home waited there instead of inside the fading memories he could never quite catch. By the time Emily's pickup truck rolled into the driveway later that evening, Ash was already sitting beside the front gate waiting for her return. She laughed softly when she saw him. "You always know exactly when I am coming back." She climbed out, carrying a small paper bag, and held it behind her back with playful secrecy. "I brought you something, but you have to be patient." Ash stood quietly, his silver eyes following every movement. Emily finally revealed a thick fleece blanket she had found at the general store. Kneeling beside him, she gently draped it across his broad shoulders. "The nights are getting colder," she whispered. "You deserve to stay warm too." The blanket carried no magic, no royal symbol, no forgotten history. Yet the instant its warmth settled around him, another image flickered across his mind. A dark cloak fastened around his shoulders by careful hands. A silver wolf emblem gleaming over his heart. A room filled with respectful silence. Then everything disappeared once again, leaving only Emily's gentle smile as she adjusted the blanket with quiet satisfaction. Ash looked at her for a long moment before carefully lowering his head into her lap. Emily froze in surprise, then slowly rested one hand against the thick fur behind his ears. Neither of them noticed the pair of distant binoculars watching from the edge of the forest, or the black vehicle parked silently beneath the pines, its unseen occupants studying the farmhouse with growing curiosity as the first stars appeared above the quiet valley. The following morning arrived wrapped in a silver mist that clung to every fence post and pine branch surrounding Emily Carter's farm. She stepped onto the porch carrying a steaming mug of coffee, smiling as she watched Ash trot across the yard with one of her curious hens waddling confidently behind him. "You have made friends with everyone except the squirrels," she teased. Ash glanced back at her, and for the briefest moment, his expression looked almost amused. It was becoming easier to forget he was a wild wolf at all. The peaceful morning lasted until the distant rumble of engines echoed through the valley. Emily frowned. Visitors rarely came this far into the hills without calling first. Dust rose above the gravel road as two dark pickup trucks rolled slowly toward her property before stopping beside the mailbox. For strangers stepped out wearing matching forest green jackets, embroidered with the emblem of the Regional Wildlife Authority. At least that was what the patches claimed. Their smiles were polite, but something about the way they quietly studied every inch of the property unsettled her. One of them approached the porch and removed his cap. "Good morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you. We are tracking reports of an unusually large wolf in this area. Have you seen anything that matches that description?" Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, though she kept her expression calm. "There are plenty of coyotes around here," she answered. "I have not seen any wolves." The man nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes drifted toward the muddy ground surrounding the chicken coop. Fresh paw prints crossed the yard, far too large to belong to any coyote. Before Emily could step between him and the tracks, another agent quietly raised a camera and snapped several photographs. Ash watched everything from behind the barn, hidden among stacked hay bales. Every instinct urged him to run toward Emily, yet another voice buried somewhere inside him insisted that remaining unseen would protect her. He stayed perfectly still, his silver eyes following each stranger with careful attention. The lead agent crouched beside one enormous paw print before standing again. "If you do happen to see the animal," he said gently, "please stay inside your house and contact us immediately. It could be confused or dangerous." Emily looked toward the old oak tree where she knew Ash was hiding, then back at the strangers. "I understand." The men returned to their trucks, but instead of leaving immediately, they paused near the road, speaking quietly among themselves while occasionally glancing back toward the farmhouse. Only after several long minutes did the vehicles finally disappear around the bend. Emily remained standing on the porch until the sound of the engines faded completely. "You can come out now," she whispered. Ash emerged cautiously from behind the barn and walked toward her. His ears remained alert, his gaze fixed on the empty road. Emily knelt beside him and rested one hand against the thick fur along his neck. "I do not know who they really were," she admitted softly. but they were not looking at you like someone rescuing a lost animal. Ash leaned gently into her hand. As their eyes met, another memory suddenly burst through his mind. Men wearing nearly identical jackets stood inside an elegant council chamber, removing their disguises to reveal formal black uniforms beneath. One voice spoke clearly enough for him to understand. "No one must discover the king before we do." The vision vanished instantly, leaving his heart racing with a fear he could not explain. He turned sharply toward the forest, scanning the distant tree line. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, he realized someone might not simply be searching for him. Someone might already know exactly where he was. That evening the valley seemed quieter than usual, as though even the wind had begun listening for something hidden among the towering pines. Emily Carter finished locking the chicken coop before glancing toward the tree line, where Ash stood perfectly still, his silver eyes fixed on the deepening shadows. Ever since the strangers had visited, he had become unusually alert. Every unfamiliar sound caused his ears to lift. Every shifting breeze drew his attention toward the forest. Emily noticed the change immediately. "Something is bothering you," she said softly as she walked closer. "I wish you could tell me what you are seeing." Ash lowered his head slightly, wishing with all his heart that he could answer. Instead, he stepped beside her as she returned to the farmhouse, refusing to let more than a few feet separate them. Night settled over the hills beneath a bright full moon, bathing the fields in soft silver light. Emily sat on the front porch wrapped in a warm sweater while reading an old gardening magazine. Ash rested near the porch steps, his eyes half closed, listening to the peaceful sounds that had become familiar over the past week. Crickets sang beneath the grass. An owl called somewhere beyond the orchard. The chickens had already settled into quiet sleep. For a little while, everything felt perfectly ordinary. Then a distant howl drifted across the valley. It was faint, almost carried away by the breeze, but Ash reacted instantly. His head snapped upward. Every muscle tightened. Another howl answered from farther away, followed by complete silence. Images exploded through his mind with startling clarity. Moonlit mountains. Hundreds of wolves standing together beneath fluttering silver banners. His own voice rising above them in a commanding howl that echoed across the kingdom. Faces turned toward him with absolute trust. Then another memory followed. A grand council chamber. A polished table covered with maps. A familiar man leaning forward with respectful eyes while saying, "Your Majesty, every pack awaits your decision." Ash staggered to his feet as the visions crashed together faster than ever before. His breathing grew uneven. Emily immediately set aside her magazine and hurried toward him. "Ash," she asked gently, "what is happening?" He looked at her, but for the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, confusion was no longer the strongest emotion in his eyes. Recognition had begun replacing it. He knew those halls. He knew those voices. He knew the weight of responsibility pressing against his shoulders, even if his own name still remained just beyond reach. Emily slowly rested her hand against the side of his neck. "You remembered something, did not you?" she whispered. Ash closed his eyes, leaning into the comforting touch. The ache inside his mind softened immediately. Another memory surfaced, quieter this time. He was walking through an elegant palace garden beside an elderly woman whose kind smile reminded him strangely of Emily. The woman had said, "A true king is never measured by the throne beneath him, but by the peace people feel when he enters the room." The words lingered long after the image disappeared. Ash opened his eyes once more. Peace. That was exactly what he had found here on this little farm. Not inside towering castles or royal chambers, but beside an Omega who had expected nothing from him except kindness. Emily smiled with quiet relief as his breathing returned to normal. "Whatever you are trying to remember," she said, "you do not have to figure it out tonight." She gently scratched behind one of his ears, earning the smallest contented sigh. "Tomorrow is another day." Neither of them noticed the small blinking light hidden high within the branches of a pine tree overlooking the farmhouse. A tiny camera silently transmitted every movement back to someone watching from miles away. On a computer screen inside a dimly lit control room, the image of the enormous silver-eyed wolf filled the monitor. One man leaned closer before speaking only 6 calm words. "We finally found the missing king." Emily Carter woke before sunrise with an uneasy feeling she could not explain. The farmhouse was still wrapped in darkness, yet Ash was already standing beside the front door instead of sleeping beneath the maple tree where he usually spent the night. His silver eyes remained fixed on the eastern tree line, every sense alert long before the first bird greeted the morning. Emily quietly opened the door and stepped onto the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. "You have been awake all night, have you not?" she asked. Ash looked back at her only briefly before returning his attention to the forest. The air smelled different today. Beneath the familiar scent of damp earth and fallen leaves lingered traces of engine oil, polished leather, and strangers who had passed nearby before dawn. Somewhere deep inside him, instincts older than memory whispered a single warning. "They are coming." Emily followed his gaze, but saw nothing except mist drifting between rows of towering pines. She reached down and gently rested her hand against his shoulder. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you are safe here." The words settled into his heart with surprising weight. Safe. He had protected countless people before forgetting his own name. Yet no one had ever spoken those simple words to him with such quiet certainty. Later that morning, Emily worked in her vegetable garden, while Ash remained unusually close, never wandering more than a few steps away. Every few minutes he glanced toward the road as though expecting visitors. Shortly before noon, the familiar rumble of engines echoed across the valley once again. This time, 3 dark vehicles appeared instead of 2. They stopped farther from the farmhouse, just beyond the old wooden bridge crossing the creek. Several figures stepped out carrying maps and binoculars, speaking calmly among themselves while studying the surrounding hills. They never crossed onto Emily's property. They simply watched. Emily narrowed her eyes. "That is the second time this week," she murmured. "Nobody searches this hard for an ordinary wolf." Ash stood silently beside her. As one of the distant men removed his sunglasses, another powerful memory burst into focus. The same face appeared seated at a polished conference table inside a magnificent chamber lined with silver banners. The man had bowed respectfully before saying, "Your Majesty, the Eastern Territories remain loyal." His name floated just beyond reach before dissolving once again. Ash lowered his head, frustrated by another memory slipping away. Emily noticed immediately. "Come on," she said gently. "We are not staying out here letting strangers make us nervous." She led him toward the farmhouse, but before reaching the porch, she paused beside the weathered fence enclosing the chicken yard. One tiny white hen had somehow slipped through a loose board and wandered into the tall grass beyond the gate. Emily sighed with an amused smile. "Daisy, you really do enjoy making life difficult." Before she could reach the frightened bird, Ash quietly circled around it with remarkable patience, carefully guiding it back toward the open gate without frightening it. The little hen hurried safely inside, while Emily laughed with genuine delight. "You really are protecting everyone here, are not you?" The compliment struck something buried deep within him. Another memory appeared, clearer than any before. Hundreds of voices echoed across a vast stone courtyard as loyal wolves saluted their king. A weathered commander smiled proudly and declared, "He protects the smallest among us before thinking of himself. That is why we follow him." The words lingered long after the vision faded. Ash slowly lifted his eyes toward Emily. For the first time, one truth remained after the memory disappeared. Whoever he had once been, protecting others had never been a duty forced upon him. It had always been his choice. Far beyond the pasture, one of the waiting observers lowered his binoculars and quietly spoke into a radio. "The behavioral profile matches perfectly. He is beginning to remember." None of them realized the greatest change was not the return of forgotten memories. It was that the king they had been searching for no longer measured home by castles, crowns, or power. Home now looked like a small farmhouse where a kind Omega smiled every time she called him Ash. The next morning arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed impossible that anything could disturb the quiet little valley Emily Carter called home. Golden sunlight spilled across the pasture, catching the dew resting on every blade of grass while the chickens wandered happily through the yard. Emily carried a basket toward the garden, but before she reached the first row of tomatoes, she noticed something unusual. Ash was standing beside the front gate, completely motionless, staring toward the distant hills as though he were listening to voices carried by the wind. "You have that look again," she said softly as she walked beside him. "The one that says your mind is somewhere I cannot follow." Ash glanced toward her, and this time something had undeniably changed. The confusion that had clouded his silver eyes for days was slowly giving way to certainty. He still could not explain it, but every sunrise seemed to return another small piece of the life he had forgotten. The breeze carried the scent of cedar, wild sage, and distant mountain snow. Suddenly the landscape before him no longer looked unfamiliar. Every ridge, every valley, every winding river seemed connected to memories that had once guided his every decision. He remembered riding across these lands beneath endless autumn skies. He remembered stopping in small farming communities, listening to ordinary families describe their hopes for peaceful harvests and safe winters. He remembered promising that every pack, no matter how small, deserved protection. Then another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. A council advisor pointed toward a map spread across an enormous oak table. "This valley produces little compared to the capital," the man had remarked. A younger version of himself had quietly smiled before answering. "Its value is not measured by taxes. Good people live there." The memory lingered instead of fading, leaving Ash standing perfectly still. Emily noticed the tears quietly gathering in his eyes and instinctively stepped closer. "It is all right," she whispered. "You do not have to carry everything alone." Those simple words unlocked something deeper than memory. He suddenly realized why her kindness had always felt so familiar. It was because she reminded him of the ruler he had always hoped to become. Not someone feared because of power, but someone remembered because of compassion. Later that afternoon, another vehicle approached the farmhouse. Though unlike the earlier visitors, only one elderly man stepped out. He wore ordinary work clothes, carried no equipment, and slowly removed his hat before speaking. "Miss Carter, I apologize for interrupting your day. My name is Walter Brooks. I have lived in these mountains for more than 40 years. Some people have been asking questions about this area, and I thought you deserved to know they are not giving honest answers." Emily frowned with concern. "What do you mean?" Walter glanced toward Ash, who quietly watched from the porch. Instead of fear, the older man's face filled with quiet amazement. "That wolf is not what they told you he is he?" Emily hesitated before answering honestly. "He has never harmed anyone." Walter nodded as though that confirmed everything. "I did not think he would." The old man lowered his voice. "There are people who want to find him before he remembers who he truly is. Be careful who you trust." Before Emily could ask another question, Walter tipped his hat politely and returned to his truck. He drove away without looking back. Silence settled over the farm once again. Emily slowly turned toward Ash. "I still do not know who you are," she admitted. "But whoever you used to be does not matter as much to me as the one standing here now." Ash walked toward her until only inches separated them. As she gently rested her hand against his forehead, the final barrier inside his mind cracked open. A magnificent throne room appeared in perfect detail. Silver banners lined towering stone walls. Loyal voices echoed through the chamber. Then, above them all, one clear voice announced with unwavering conviction, "Long live King Cale Ashford." The name struck him like the first sunrise after a long winter. Cale. At last, he remembered his name. He closed his eyes, not with fear, but with gratitude, because before he had remembered he was a king, a kind Omega had already reminded him how to be a good man. Cale Ashford opened his eyes beneath the fading afternoon sun, and for the first time since the storm had carried him into Emily Carter's quiet life, every forgotten piece finally settled into place. He remembered the royal castle rising above the northern cliffs. He remembered the council that had trusted his judgment. He remembered the oath he had spoken before every alpha and every pack across the kingdom. Most of all, he remembered the promise he had made to protect even the smallest corner of his realm. His gaze slowly returned to the little farmhouse standing beneath the old maple tree. Somehow, without titles or ceremonies, this humble place had fulfilled that promise better than any throne room ever could. Emily watched the change in his expression with quiet wonder. She could not explain why, but she knew the search was over. "You remember now," she whispered. Cale stepped closer and gently lowered his head in front of her, not as a frightened wolf seeking comfort, but as a grateful soul honoring the person who had restored what power never could. Emily smiled through grateful tears and rested both hands against the soft fur around his face. "I am happy you found your way home," she said. Before another word could be spoken, several vehicles appeared at the end of the gravel road. This time they did not stop in secret. Men and women dressed in elegant black uniforms stepped forward before quietly lowering themselves onto one knee the moment they saw the great silver-eyed wolf. No commands were shouted. No fear filled the valley. Only respectful silence remained. Their leader removed his cap and spoke with unmistakable relief. "Your Majesty, we have searched every corner of the Northern Kingdom. Welcome home." Emily stared in disbelief as every strange clue from the past weeks suddenly fit together. The missing king, the mysterious search teams, the forgotten memories. The enormous wolf she had welcomed into her chicken coop had never been an ordinary traveler. He had been the ruler of an entire kingdom. Kale slowly stepped back before a gentle silver light surrounded him. Moments later, a tall man stood where the great wolf had been. His dark hair stirred in the autumn breeze, and his calm silver eyes were exactly the same eyes that had looked at Emily with quiet gratitude on the very first night they met. He wore no crown. He carried no symbol of power. Yet everyone waiting near the road instinctively recognized their king. Kale looked only at Emily. "My name is Kale Ashford," he said softly. "But before I remembered that, you reminded me who I was meant to be." Emily smiled, still trying to understand everything that had happened. "You were kind long before you remembered being a king." Kale glanced toward the little chicken coop where frightened hens had once welcomed a lost stranger without knowing his name. A quiet laugh escaped him. "I searched an entire lifetime for wisdom inside castles and councils," he said. "Instead, I found it beside a small farmhouse where compassion expected nothing in return." Several weeks later, the Northern Kingdom celebrated the joyful return of its king. Yet the place Kale visited most often was not the royal palace. Whenever his duties allowed, he returned to the little valley where Emily still gathered fresh eggs every morning and greeted every sunrise with the same quiet smile. The royal guards eventually stopped asking why their king preferred sitting beside a weathered fence watching chickens wander through the grass. They already knew the answer. Great kingdoms were protected by strength, but great hearts were restored by kindness. Every autumn, when the wind carried the scent of cedar across the hills, Kale would pause beside the old chicken coop and remember the storm that had taken away his memories only to lead him towards something far more valuable. He had arrived as a king who had forgotten his past, but he left with a future shaped forever by the gentle Omega who never saw a throne before she chose to see a soul.